Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to present at the seminar. So this is joint work with Jeyul, who is one of our PhD students here at Illinois, and Ben Iverson and Ray Kluender. So we are looking at bankruptcies, and we are going to cover the spectrum of bankruptcies. I think this is one of the first papers that I know of that looks at consumer bankruptcy, in particular small business bankruptcy, which I think we know a lot less about, and large corporate bankruptcy. So I think that we're going to learn something about how bankruptcy works, in particular for the small business sector that we don't know a lot about, as well as how things are working in this crisis, which is pretty surprising in almost all sectors of the economy, and bankruptcy is no exception to that. So as a little bit of motivating background, and to give you some context of what we should expect bankruptcies to be doing in a normal recession, this just plots the time series of bankruptcies in blue, of total bankruptcy filings, and unemployment. And so what we'll see is that these two lines are somewhat correlated, in particular with the business cycle. And in gray, we have the MBR recessions. So in particular with the last cycle, we saw that the red and blue lines are pretty highly correlated. The coefficient is about 0.84. And, particularly in the last business cycle, we saw, and one interesting takeaway from this graph is that bankruptcies and unemployment rate move pretty much contemporaneously. This is on a quarterly level. So if we see an increase in unemployment rate or any other, similar macro variable, we should see bankruptcies increase pretty much immediately. So pretty contemporaneously. And we see a similar correlation with past recessions as well. But, so this kind of begs the question that we know that unemployment rates skyrocketed during the most recent recession starting in March. And we see in the red line, kind of that huge hockey stick there. So the question is, what did bankruptcies do? And you can already get a little bit of a preview of our results that we see the blue line kind of start to dip a little bit. So our question is trying to estimate what happened to different types of bankruptcies, and of course, trying to unpack the reasons why. And what can we expect going forward through the rest of this crisis, and what are some policy implications of our results? So as a little bit more background on the economics of bankruptcy plays an essential role in recessions. And one of my kind of commentary points is that bankruptcy policy really isn't designed to be cyclical, isn't designed to move with the business cycle. Even though we know, as I just showed, bankruptcies increase during recessions, policy is more about kind of the partial equilibrium, thinking about, for a given firm or consumer, is liquidation or discharge more efficient, or is reorganization more efficient for that debt? But in particular, in recessions, we think that the consequences of inefficient liquidation or discharge might be even more severe than during normal times. So I'm going to highlight the differences between different chapters, because that's going to be important going forward. We're going to look at different chapters of bankruptcies for households as well as businesses to look at the patterns of how these different chapters evolved and compare and contrast them to try to get at the mechanisms of what's going on during this crisis. So for households, there's two chapters, Chapter 7 and 13. So Chapter 7 is the more generous form of bankruptcy, where a household files and essentially gets almost 100% of their debt wiped away. And for Chapter 13, usually for higher income debtors, they have to pay, they have to do a 3 or 5 year repayment plan to repay some of their debt in exchange of being able to keep some of their key assets. Namely, a lot of people file for Chapter 13 in order to keep their house. So it allows them to keep an asset in exchange for paying down some debt. For businesses, the two key chapters are 7 and 11. Here we also have a similar breakdown, and it tends to be the larger businesses, more corporate entities that tend to use Chapter 11, and that's a reorganization chapter that allows at least some fraction of businesses to continue operating while reorganizing their debts, while Chapter 7 is a liquidation chapter. So we have a similar breakdown across chapters for households and businesses. And demand for these functions, again, thinking historically, we expected it to increase during this crisis. And so the genesis of this project was kind of in March, back when the coronavirus crisis was first starting. Being a researcher who studied bankruptcy for many years, I was really concerned that we would see a huge spike in bankruptcies and what the implications of that would be for the bankruptcy system. So I started collecting data in real time, worried about these inefficiencies. And my co-author, Ben Iverson, has done work on court congestion, showing that in a recession, when a lot of businesses are filing at the same time, that can lead to inefficiencies as well. So demand for these functions may increase, and there might be potential inefficiencies. The two that I'm going to highlight are potential court congestion, and there might be people and businesses that are trying to file for bankruptcy or may benefit, especially in a macro downturn, but may be constrained from doing so. So you actually have to pay thousands of dollars in legal fees in order to access the bankruptcy system. And those liquidity constraints might bind, particularly in recessions. So that kind of provides a little context of what we're studying here. And I'll also put a note out for some related policy work that I and some of my co-authors are involved in. So we're actually a part of a working group of law and economics and finance professors that we've written a few letters to Congress suggesting that in this crisis in particular, that small businesses might benefit from kind of a pause period, that 180 days of having a lift on the debt obligations that they have to pay to kind of wait out the recession and maybe allow for more small businesses to stay in business and keep those employment ties going, and that might have beneficial macroeconomic consequences. So that effort is ongoing. And I'll also put a note out that Joe Biden has adopted a really aggressive bankruptcy reform plan originally formulated by Elizabeth Warren. And so we could see some interesting changes in the bankruptcy system. And so hopefully the research that we're doing will also feed into that going forward. The objectives, and I'll probably pause here after going through this slide for some initial questions. So our goals of this paper are to first empirically estimate the impact of COVID-19 on bankruptcy rates across all, the universe of bankruptcies in the United States and across these different groups, as well as different chapters, and using that evidence to try to decompose the mechanisms of the changes in bankruptcy filing rates. And that, one question we get asked all the time is, what do we think bankruptcies are going to do going forward? And in order to know that, we really need to know these mechanisms and to try to identify any potential inefficiencies there might be in the bankruptcy system, in particular, potentially court congestion and barriers to access. And finally, with these results, we can hopefully generate some policy implications on what could mitigate these inefficiencies. So I'll pause here for a second just to see if there are any initial questions.
So one question that there is, can you speak to potential zombification of the American corporate sector? So, in Europe, for example, there is a big issue that a lot of firms get support even though they are not economically viable. Do you think that something like this might be happening in the US now when there are a lot of government support to the companies and probably even sectors of the economy? We should probably go through the restructuring rather than to get, continuous support.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have not seen too many concerns. I mean, certainly in Japan and other countries, there have been, evidence and policy concerns about kind of just banks, continuing to lend to zombie businesses to keep them afloat in order to prevent political implications of letting those companies fail. I have not seen that in the United States. And if anything, one fact that I learned recently is that we are not going to get official statistics from the BLS and other government sources on the fraction of, in particular, small businesses that have failed during the coronavirus crisis until 2021 or potentially even 2022. So if anything, my sense is that small businesses are really at the epicenter of this crisis, and other research has pointed to the fact that the demand that, kind of the main economic shock when it comes to the current crisis is kind of a decline in demand for in-person services, that anything that requires you to go somewhere else where there's other people, such as restaurants, lodging, air travel, those are the businesses that have been most heavily hit. And that, if anything, we're seeing a lot of those businesses are kind of small. So small restaurants is one prime example of that. And that we're seeing them fail potentially in massive numbers, although we actually do not know how many of them are failing, which is a huge problem. And one thing that the bankruptcy statistics, because it is something we have right now, as opposed to waiting 2 years for, can help us shed light on. But if anything, I think the potential inefficiency is that we're going to see too many small businesses fail. We're going to see fire sales of their assets. Like nobody wants a used pizza oven right now, and those assets are going to sell for almost nothing. We're going to see severing of employment ties, and if anything, maybe lack of lending or support to those businesses as opposed to the opposite.
Okay. Do you also consider the effects of COVID-19 funding and support options for small businesses on bankruptcy rates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we get to the mechanism section, I mean, this is one of the challenges with any research on COVID-19 is how do you disentangle the million things that are going on at the same time? So that part is still in progress right now. And certainly things like exposure to PPP, and there have been several other really good studies on that. We're going to draw on that evidence. We haven't done that yet. So I'm going to really rely on the audience here to generate good ideas that we can use to take to the, to finish up this paper, to look at what are the key mechanisms driving this. But currently, we have not looked at government support for businesses thus far, but obviously that's an immediate next step.
This is not related to the point of this paper, but the audience would like to know what are the promised changes by Biden to the bankruptcy rules?
So from what the last I heard, and I don't think this is, written in stone, they're not committed to, that they have to do this, but from what I understood, he sort of adopted Elizabeth Warren's plan, which is and I think it generally makes sense to me, those policy proposals that were made, which is to roll back some of what occurred in BAPSIPA, which is a 2005 change to bankruptcy law, and actually have a separate paper that is under review right now that looks directly at this 2005 change, which is a last very dramatic change that affected consumers in particularly, and that essentially in a nutshell made bankruptcy a lot more difficult for consumers. And we think that it happened right before the Great Recession. It was probably not great timing macroeconomically to make it much harder for consumers to write off their debts right before a huge financial crisis. And of course that law is still in effect now and makes it much harder. And I mentioned lack of access as one of the key potential inefficiencies that we're going to find some evidence for here in our paper. That Elizabeth Warren believes that that was a bad thing, that you're making it much more difficult for many households to use the bankruptcy system to write down their debt. And so that rolls back a lot of those provisions. And what a really neat idea is proposing a streamlined bankruptcy system. The idea is that we have to pay, for Chapter 7 or 13 bankruptcy, a household actually has to pay $1,000 or $2,000, which is a little bit counterintuitive that, how can a bankrupt household, who is by definition bankrupt, come up with several $1,000s to pay a lawyer? So, and we have another paper that's been published several years ago that shows that those liquidity constraints actually prevent a large fraction of people from being able to access the system at all. So she proposes a streamlined system that kind of reduce a lot of those, both pecuniary and non-pecuniary costs. So I think it's a neat idea, but I don't know that there's like a very detailed plan for the exact law that would be implemented.
All right, thank you.
All right, perfect. So these are our goals. And so I'm going to focus mostly on the first part, which is to empirically estimate the impact on bankruptcy rates. And then, as I mentioned, the last two are works in progress. And I would love audience feedback on the key mechanisms and particular empirical ways that we can measure things like economic uncertainty, which is very difficult to measure, especially in volatile times like this. So moving on into, again, focusing most of my time here on the empirical analysis, one great thing is that unlike almost every other study on COVID-19 that I've seen, we actually have the universe of a really important economic outcome. So about 1% of US households and about 10% of them file for bankruptcy at, over time at some point, about 1% of them every year. And so, this is a financial event that happens to a large fraction of all households and, a lot of businesses and small businesses as well. So trillions of dollars are transferred through the bankruptcy system every single year. So it's a really important bankruptcy outcome, but there's no sample selection here. So we're not just looking at, for example, consumers of JP Morgan Chase Bank or other, and there's been a really great discussion among researchers about the problems of sample selection with measuring certain important types of outcomes. So we have no sample selection bias here. We are using the universe of all bankruptcy filings in the US. And this comes directly from the court system. So there's essentially no measurement error at all. And we're literally using the universe. So PACER is the name of the court online system, and this is actually the system that lawyers and filers use to directly upload their documents and literally to file for bankruptcy. So we're pulling data directly from the administrative source that is used directly by bankruptcy filers. And we combine this with another government data source. This is mainly just to reduce costs. I think it probably costs about $100 for each week of the universe of bankruptcy filings. And so to mitigate those costs, we collect the 2019 data from a publicly available data source called the Federal Judicial Center. And we have some summary data about each filing, including the exact date, the name of the filer, the chapter, some information about location, and importantly, whether it's a consumer or business filing. So we're going to kind of aggregate that at the national level to look at trends and then disaggregate that by state and things like that. And as I mentioned, we're collecting a huge variety of cross-sectional measures. So I'm going to show you the time series and cross-sectional measures by one important measure, which is the state unemployment rate, but we're collecting a host of other measures to try to throw the kitchen sink at this question to try to get at mechanisms. So this is ongoing, but we really would love any suggestions for additional, empirical measures that we can develop to address some of the mechanisms that that may be driving our results. So the key punchline here, as I alluded to earlier, is that this crisis is unlike any past recession. That up is down, left is right, and bankruptcies are no exception to that. So I mentioned, me and almost every other bankruptcy expert and scholar that I know, we're expecting a flood of bankruptcy filings for this crisis, and we saw the exact opposite. That overall bankruptcies are down compared with 2019 by about 30% year over year. And this particularly applies for consumers and small businesses that make up the vast majority of bankruptcy filings. And the only category that is up, so kind of is going as expected, are corporate Chapter 11s, which are up by 39%. And corporate Chapter 11s for large businesses make up a tiny fraction of overall bankruptcy filings. So even though those are up, and for large businesses, it's up dramatically over 300%. But again, those make up an even tinier share of overall bankruptcy filings, although probably important in terms of the economic value of those bankruptcies. But large corporate Chapter 11s are the only type of bankruptcy that actually has gone up. That every other type has gone down, and that presents a pretty big mystery that to answer why are bankruptcies behaving the opposite way in this recession compared with past recessions that we've looked at. And another, even so, in the time series, we're seeing bankruptcies move in the opposite way as the prior business cycle. And this is also the case in the cross section, that in states that had larger increases in unemployment during the COVID-19 crisis, bankruptcies declined by more. So this is, to me, an even bigger mystery. And we're struggling essentially to understand why. And once we figure that out, we can finish the paper. The takeaway, my tentative takeaway to try to understand and grapple with these results is that the COVID-19 recession has led to a lot of heterogeneity in the economy and divergence in outcomes between large corporations, homeowners. I'm going to kind of break the bankruptcy filer population into about three big chunks. One is large corporations, they're behaving as normal. And I argue that seeing an increase in Chapter 11s in a recession may actually be a good thing, because the bankruptcy system is designed, and there's a really nice new theory paper by Giorgio Pasantino and others that suggests that encouraging bankruptcy and just, allowing a organized renegotiation of debt can be a good thing, especially in a recession. Large corporations are functioning as normal, and the bankruptcy system is there to help, which is a good thing. And homeowners, we may have seen those bankruptcies decline, which are particularly affecting Chapter 13, which are the higher income people who are more likely to be homeowners. We may see those bankruptcies declining because they're benefiting a lot from the large government stimulus. So the CARES Act is $2 trillion of money pumped into the economy, and that may be benefiting the relatively wealthier households. But we're seeing that non-homeowners and small businesses, the Chapter 7 filers, may be facing barriers to filing. And I'm going to show you some tentative evidence of that. So that the last part is a potentially bad outcome that could be evidence of inefficiencies that would, exacerbate the recession. But these are all tentative conclusions. We don't have a final answer yet on exactly why we're seeing bankruptcies go down by so much. Another thing you might be wondering is that maybe the courts are just shut down because of COVID-19 itself, and that's why people aren't filing for bankruptcy. So that's definitely not directly true. So there's no court that is just closed, that literally is not having any bankruptcy filings anymore. So, and we're going to look directly at this later on in the presentation to look directly at the timing of court shutdown. So each court can decide, is it going to shut down physically or not? And the timing was, there's some variation cross-sectionally across geographic areas. And so you see a lot of, about half of courts did move to what they call telephonic hearings. And this is just an example of this order for the Middle District of Alabama. And so it's not true that courts have totally, shut down or not taking any bankruptcies anymore. And even the ones that are shut down physically are taking them online. And, just to preview those results in case I don't get into them too much, we're not seeing direct evidence that even moving to virtual hearings and moving more toward electronic filing really has any impact on the filing rates. So that is also actually a little bit surprising to me, that I would have expected a shift to online, thinking about similarly for us shifting to online teaching will cause a disruption, but we're actually not finding any evidence that the physical shutdowns of courts have any impact on the bankruptcy filing rates. So to summarize, we think that there's, even though there's so many things going on at the same time, there's probably 4 key channels that can potentially help us explain why bankruptcies are dropping. So one is that substitutes for bankruptcy, there's less demand for bankruptcy because, again, the federal government pumped $2 trillion into the economy. So if you're getting tons of money, and many households we know are earning more than 100% or were earning more than 100% of their pre-recession income through enhanced unemployment checks. So because the stimulus was so large, and things like PPP for businesses and Main Street lending program from the Fed, just reduced demand for bankruptcy. And I certainly think that that's part of the story. Another potential channel is that uncertainty has increased, that households don't know how bad the recession is going to be or how it's going to play out. So you don't necessarily want to exercise the option value of bankruptcy immediately once the crisis hits. And then there's potential physical constraints that I already mentioned of court shutdowns or COVID-19 just making it hard to do things and go to lawyers' offices and things like that. And then finally, liquidity constraints, of which I have a previous paper that shows that it's actually very consistent with the results we're finding in this recession, that basically in the last 2 recessions in 2001 and 2008, we found that when the government gave out stimulus checks, we saw Chapter 7 bankruptcies increase. And so it's a weird thing. Government gives you money and then you file for bankruptcy. And we interpret that as evidence of liquidity constraints. Again, you have to come up with several $1,000s to file. And that's even greater for small businesses compared with consumers. So we are finding similar effects in this recession, if not even larger than the effects we found previously. So I'm going to pause really briefly for questions again before moving on to the empirical results.
I think probably it looks more like a comment rather than a question. So there are many help programs, especially some promotion rates from credit card and flexible payment plans that should help to alleviate the bankruptcy. If you would like to comment on this.
Yeah, so I would put that in the substitutes expanding bucket. And I definitely think, that's a whole host of things. And we're developing measures of things, we're trying to hit like what we think are probably the biggest empirically measurable factors in each bucket. So we're trying to measure things like PPP exposure, the forbearance, kind of mortgage and eviction forbearance that was put in place by the CARES Act. But I definitely would put private sector, kind of just reduction in financial distress or reduction in collections activity, more leniency by credit card companies, and private sector forbearance or workout programs into that bucket as well.
Can you talk a little bit, or maybe you're going to have in your results, because some areas they have, for example, rent eviction freezes, some areas don't. Do you see that there's difference in personal bankruptcy filings across the areas which have differential treatment of rental?
Yeah, so we are measuring that right now. And there is a great website called the Eviction Lab, which I think is out of Princeton, and we are trying to code that up. We don't have those results currently, but that's exactly right.
So how about endogenous change in consumption expenditures and so on? Wouldn't they have a lagged effect on bankruptcy?
Endogenous change in consumption. So do you mean
well, demand for pants is down, so people don't really consume some of the things that they had to spend money for earlier.
Yeah, so I don't know, probably I would put that in bucket 1 as well. So we know that spending went down a lot, and some of that was voluntary, that you are just, you don't have to, you're not going, well, voluntary in the sense that it was not driven by not having the money to spend. Like, you're not going to restaurants or not going on vacations a lot. So financial distress is easing. And we definitely see a lot of indicators for that. The household savings rate, I think, reached record levels in the United States, for all historical, since it's been measured, I think reached 30 or 40% in April. So we definitely are seeing, at least on average, that financial distress is probably lower for households. So I think that that's a piece of it as well.
All right, thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for this really great. I feel like it's kind of this challenge for me to try to address all the different questions, many of which I haven't heard before. So I'm going to move on to our first set of empirical results, which again just tries to document what happened during bankruptcy, what happened to bankruptcies in the last 8 months or so. And so we're going to use an event study approach. It's a very simple regression approach, but I really love the way that it can suck away all of that noise. I'm going to show you daily results, and we're going to put together a specification that saturates all of that daily noise, so we can really look on a day-by-day basis, how did bankruptcy change across all the different types of bankruptcies. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a calendar time. And I'm also going to show you that 2019 was actually a really great control for 2020. So it's great for us empirically, but it's a very, very simple regression approach where we can saturate the regression with indicators for day of the week, day of the month, and month of the year, which takes away all that seasonality. And so we're essentially just going to compare log changes in bankruptcy filing rates for each type of bankruptcy between 2019 and 2020. And the way we're going to do that, the regressions of interest, the coefficients of interest, are just these dummy variables on every single day of calendar time, again, taking away all seasonal variation for every single day of 2020. And the control for that is 2019. And we currently have updated our data up to about mid-October, which are the results I'm going to show you. So these are the results for consumer and business bankruptcies. So consumer bankruptcies make up the majority of bankruptcies. So the overall bankruptcy rate is going to look pretty similar to the consumer graph. So I'm not going to show you that. And the first, I'm going to kind of draw your attention to the left side graph and the first period, which is January until March 14th. And we see there that the coefficients are just around 0, and the year-over-year change in just the raw bankruptcy rates in that sort of Q1 January to March period was only 0.6%. So essentially, what that shows is that the first part of 2020, or the first quarter, 2019 was a great control for 2020. And so we don't put in a dummy for 2020, importantly. So there's no mechanical normalization. So it could be that all bankruptcies are just higher, or they're on a different trend in 2020 compared with 2019. So it's not a mechanical effect, that we're finding literally the level of bankruptcy in the first quarter is identical prior to the onset of COVID. And so next, we just break the remaining time periods into 1.5-month periods, just on a somewhat ad hoc basis, to help break into different COVID periods that are a result of different policy interventions. So we see that right about March 15th, which is the first vertical line there, we are seeing bankruptcies dropping. And in particular, it's easiest to see on the consumer side. And that coincides with the declaration of a national emergency on March 13th. And as I mentioned, one set of results I will show you is court shutdowns, the physical closure of courts. Of course, they all remained open for some type of electronic filing throughout this entire period. And so we see the biggest drop in bankruptcies between mid-March and the end of April, which is the first period between the first two vertical lines. And then the bankruptcy rates more or less stabilize. For consumers, around 30 to 40% below 2019 levels. And for businesses, businesses are much rarer, business bankruptcies, but it kind of has fluctuated up and down. But you see in the right-hand graph there that there's no significant pattern there. And overall, so on the top headings, I'm showing the overall year-to-date changes in bankruptcy, just comparing 2019 to 20, the overall bankruptcy filings. Consumers are down about 29%, and businesses are almost 0. So overall business filings have not changed at all. But as we dig deeper, we'll see that that is very heterogeneous between large and small businesses and between different types of consumers. Another thing I will mention is that since we did update the data to the end of October, there have been a lot of events that have happened. So one thing I'll point out is that the $1,200 CARES Act stimulus payments occurred on April 15th, and we see that the consumer rate reversed, right? Almost, when you look at the daily coefficients, and almost exactly that day to the day that we saw a reversal of the decline. So this, again, is consistent with our evidence from prior recessions that when the government gives people money, actually Chapter 7 filings increase. And we are actually seeing this much more dramatically in this recession compared with previous recessions. I don't want to draw too many conclusions from the time series alone, but it's notable that the bankruptcy rate actually started to increase right when the government was first starting to give out large amounts of money through the CARES Act. And we also saw the same effect happen in the end of July. So on the right-hand panel, I just list some of the key dates that a lot of people were concerned. Again, the same bankruptcy experts that, including myself, that expected bankruptcies to skyrocket in March, expected them to skyrocket when the enhanced UI checks expired. So that extra $600 a week of additional unemployment checks that were being given out expired at the end of July. And so we expected bankruptcy rates to increase then, and that didn't happen either. And in fact, bankruptcy rates started dropping. So we're actually seeing consumer filing rates being positively correlated with money being given out by the government. And that is consistent with liquidity constraints that many people may not be able to afford a bankruptcy filing. But again, just time series evidence, so I don't want to, we don't have definitive evidence on that yet. So next, I'm going to show you the results that break things down across different types of consumers and different types of businesses. And we see that the results are very different. So the consumer result was that bankruptcy filings decreased, but the patterns, and this is true across both main chapters of consumer bankruptcy, but the patterns are a little bit different. So just to review, Chapter 7 is filers tend to be lower income people, and Chapter 13 is often used for homeowners to help save their house from foreclosure. And we see that again. And another key difference, important for the bankruptcy system in our kind of analysis of the mechanisms, is that you have to pay upfront for Chapter 7 because almost all of your debts get wiped away. A lawyer's not going to accept, payment on credit because you're never going to repay them. So it actually costs about $1,000 to $2,000 to pay upfront for Chapter 7, but that's not the case for Chapter 13. So you can roll your legal fees into the Chapter 13 plan itself. So liquidity constraints are much more binding for Chapter 7 compared with 13. So again, the time series argument that I mentioned, the fact that in mid-April, right as the government started giving out checks, Chapter 7 rates increased, but Chapter 13 rates stayed at a depressed level, at least provides some qualitative evidence, some circumstantial evidence in favor of liquidity constraints as one explanation for the patterns that we see. So Chapter 13 rates tend to be wealthier and tend to be homeowners. Those rates have remained more than 50% below 2019 rates through the entire time period that we're looking at.
Jialan,
yeah.
Very briefly, if you can go to the previous slide, do you think if you were compare 2018 to 2019, you're going to have a flat line throughout, or is going to look somewhat similar?
That's a good question. So we do have that data. We could easily do that from the Federal Judicial Center. Anyone who's interested in bankruptcy, there's micro data available publicly through the FJC, the individual filings. And so please use that data source starting in 2018 up to it's just about to be released this month for the last year. So we have not looked at that directly. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
But I not too much happened between 2018 and 19. So I would speculate that it would probably be similar, but I'm not. That's a good point. Obviously, for robustness, we would want to look at, extend our analysis to including previous years and things like that, just to make sure our results aren't driven by 2019 specifically. Perfect. So I showed you the differences between, I'm going to lump very broadly, non-homeowners, lower income people for Chapter 7 and homeowners, higher income for Chapter 13. And for businesses, we can also break things down in a similar way. So Chapter 7 tends to be smaller businesses, and this is the liquidation chapter, which just helps businesses, kind of liquidate in a more organized fashion and maybe help avoid fire sales and provide more value back to creditors. So, and Chapter 11 is more often used by very large corporations to reorganize. And so, again, we're seeing divergent results. So overall for businesses, there's almost a zero effect for all of 2020. But that's very different for small businesses versus large. So small businesses declined significantly by 14% year to date. And that's including the Q1 period that nothing happened. So it's much greater during the COVID period. And Chapter 11 rates increase. So essentially, because there's fewer Chapter 7s, they end up actually canceling out overall. But that doesn't mean business bankruptcies haven't changed in 2020. And so the interesting result here, again, one motivation for this paper is that we know very little about small business bankruptcy. And one interesting fact here is that we're seeing small business Chapter 7 filers behave pretty similarly to consumer Chapter 7 filers. So the time series patterns look pretty similar. So I'm just going to scroll through these two. So if you compare the left-hand graphs, and this is consistent with the basic intuition that many small businesses, like sole proprietors, for example, are often even financed with a lot of personal debt. So this is a research area I'm going to be working in, or that I'm working in going forward, is interactions between household and small business credit. And so, that's an interesting takeaway from this analysis that, there's been very little empirical study of small business bankruptcies more generally. But as, we do see an increase in Chapter 11, even though you don't see much in the time series pattern, because it's driven very lumpily by, all of these spikes are some large business like Kmart or Sears going bankrupt with many, many subsidiaries. So you're not seeing a large trend, but it is gone up year over year. And in the paper, we show that for the larger, so we can group businesses, we have a little more fine-grained data on large business bankruptcies, and we can group them by asset size. And the larger the asset size, so for bankruptcies over 50 million in assets, that has gone up by actually 300% in 2020. So it's the larger the business is, the more bankruptcies have gone up for Chapter 11 filings. And as I said, we have a little bit more detailed data from new generation research for large corporate Chapter 11s, and we can break things down by industry. So here, this shows the year-over-year change in the fraction of bankruptcies comparing 2019 to 2020 in each month of the year. And we see here that in the blue and the green, so the blue and the green diamonds, that the restaurant and retail sectors that we think may have been the most heavily hit by COVID had the highest bankruptcy rates. But these were in particular thinking about retail. These were already sectors that were kind of already in trouble prior to COVID-19. So my takeaway when it comes to large corporate bankruptcies is that COVID-19 kind of exacerbated pre-existing trends in specific sectors, such as retail. But one sector I would just highlight, one sector I'm really worried about for large and small businesses is the hotel or accommodation sector. So if you look at CMBS default rates, for example, the lodging sector is, has like 20% default rates or something like that on commercial properties. So that's the sector that I am particularly most concerned about going into, for the rest of this recession. So these tables just show the numbers behind the results that I just showed. So looking at consumer versus business, and I think I'm not going to go through this in detail other than to highlight the assets over 50 million cut, which shows very large increases of several fold in bankruptcy rates. The second key result I want to show you is cross-sectional. So I already showed you in the time series, we're seeing very surprising trends for bankruptcies. They have gone down instead of up for most categories. And I'm going to show you that kind of contradiction of our expectations is also the case in the cross section. So here we've just broken states down by the change that, we're going to kind of make it consistent with our earlier evidence, just looking at year-over-year changes between 2019 and 20. And we're going to look at the year-over-year change for each state in both the unemployment rate and the bankruptcy filing rate. And here I'm again showing the two major chapters of consumer bankruptcy and the two major chapters of business bankruptcy. And the key takeaway of this result is that we actually have a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and bankruptcy filings in every single type of bankruptcy. So I'm not going to make too much out of the slopes, especially when it comes to corporate Chapter 11s, because a business can be based in one state but have a lot of employees or revenues in other states. But and for businesses, those bankruptcies are much rarer than for consumers, so much less precisely estimated. But the key takeaway here is that every single graph has a negative slope, which means that states that are harder hit by the recession have fewer bankruptcy filings. And so I'm going to get a little bit more into kind of the details of that going forward. But this is the exact same graph for the last recession. So this is unemployment versus bankruptcies between 2007 and 10. So from the Great Recession, we saw the expected relationship, which is that harder hit states have higher bankruptcy filings. But again, we're seeing a violation of that in the cross section in our results. So
I have a couple of questions here, if you don't mind me reading them for you. So could it be as firms make their employees redundant, their costs are reduced, saving them from bankruptcy? So maybe that can partly explain why bankruptcy is not following the same trend as unemployment.
So if a business is cut employees, then they don't need to file for bankruptcy. But how does that relate to the last recession? So in the last recession, we're seeing high unemployment rates correspond with large, more bankruptcies by businesses and consumers.
Okay. Didn't the states with high unemployment implement more business and consumer support?
Yeah, so that's definitely a complication that obviously unemployment is generally thought of as a proxy for distress, but here we also have unprecedented levels of government intervention. And so I mentioned before that the unemployment insurance paycheck, checks that people were getting were so generous that they actually exceeded their income when they were working for many households, and that household savings were going up as a result of that. So it could be the case that states where there's more unemployment got more generous unemployment checks and therefore reduced bankruptcy filing rates. Now, I think that's part of the story. Government intervention is part of the story, but I will speak to that by looking at the time series of results. So I think in the next slide, I will actually show this. So the timing to me doesn't fully line up. So the gap between low and high unemployment states was the greatest in the initial period of the recession. And this was before the government intervention. So to me, that story doesn't fully hold. And actually the gap has closed to the extent that for almost all types of bankruptcies, there actually isn't a gap between high and low unemployment anymore. So I'm just going to point you to the column 3 here, which shows that in the initial COVID period, so again, think of the CARES Act was passed in late March, the stimulus checks, which are one of the earliest forms of actual relief that people were getting, was April 15th. So most of the first period, the column 3 there, people and businesses weren't getting a ton of government support yet. But that's when we see a huge gap between the low and high unemployment states. So this just splits each state by the quintile of the change in unemployment rate. And here we see the lowest quintile, there was 30% decline in Chapter 7 and 45% decline in Chapter 13. For the highest quintile, those are 41 and 61. So pretty big. So I think this explains 25% of the time series variation. So the difference between the lowest and highest quintile explains a pretty large share of the overall decline in bankruptcies. And that was concentrated in the initial period before people were getting stimulus checks. So you need a little bit more complicated story to explain, that was before they actually got money from PPP and from the stimulus checks and the unemployment checks. So and we see if we compare to the latest period between August and October, the gap in Chapter 7 rates has completely disappeared, and there is still a gap in the Chapter 13 rates. So I would think that for Chapter 13, maybe the continued divergence between low and high unemployment rates could be partially explained by generous government support, but the fact that gap opened up the most before government support was received, again, this is a little bit of a circumstantial evidence, but that's kind of my interpretation of the evidence that we have. So any other questions on the first two pieces, which the time series results, differences across chapters and consumer versus business, as well as the cross-sectional results by unemployment rate before I move on to the next series of results?
You also have data on liquidation on small businesses without Chapter 7?
We don't. So as I mentioned, the official government statistics don't come out until next year or the year after. And the best evidence that's, that people have been coming up with comes from private sources, such as Yelp actually ends up being one of the best sources we've had on business closures during the current recession. Think about a restaurant you go to on Yelp, it says closed or permanently closed. And so, but that evidence is not very comprehensive. We don't have great time series of, well, we know that a lot of restaurants close in normal times as well. So there's some evidence that suggests a large fraction of businesses close. From looking at historical data, we can make some inferences because we do have historical data from past recessions that about, our calculations suggest that a little under 10% of all small businesses that fail actually file for Chapter 7 or file for bankruptcy. So it's a tiny fraction of all failures result in a bankruptcy, but we don't really have a good sense of how much that's changed until we can get more comprehensive nationwide statistics that don't come from Yelp.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. So those are our time series and cross-sectional results. And now I mentioned 4 key mechanisms for why are we seeing bankruptcies drop so much. And we're going to try to just attack them systematically. And we're kind of midway through that exercise. So the first set of hypotheses we're going to tackle is physical constraints. The fact that courts may be physically shut down and maybe people don't have internet and it's very difficult for them to file online. And there can be various complications with that. So the first thing we're going to look at is the fact that not all courts actually shut down physically and that they shut down at different times. So this is a histogram of about 51 out of 90 courts nationwide have shut down. So a little more than half have shut down at all. And this is a histogram of the timing of those shutdowns. So they all happened around in a few week period, but they didn't happen at exactly the same time. So we're going to leverage both the fact that not all courts shut down and the fact that they shut down at different times in, again, a simple event study analysis. And this is a map that shows the timing of when courts shut down. So the gray areas are the courts that never shut down, and the lighter colors are the earlier shutdowns, and the darker colors are toward the later time of the courts that did actually shut down. So we have pretty good variation. It's not all concentrated in particular places, and even within state, there's some courts that shut down and some that didn't. So the first and most convincing evidence to me, and this is actually pretty surprising to me, that courts moving to purely online operations actually didn't seem to have an impact on filing rates. So this is just a simple regression where we replicate our main analysis, and I'm just not showing you the standard errors here so make it easier to compare between the treated and control states. So the 51 courts that shut down at some point, the colored courts here versus the gray ones that never shut down throughout this entire period. And to me, the most convincing evidence is on the left, and for consumers, we're just rerunning our main specification for those two groups, and those lines are identical. So the timing, and this is actually very consistent with other evidence. If you look at consumer spending between states that had like shelter-in-place orders versus not, they actually followed really similar trends, and the timing didn't really change. So we're seeing bankruptcies kind of behave similarly to a consumption good, is one way to summarize our results. And for businesses, it's noisy, but we're also not seeing consistent results in terms of courts that shut down versus not. Another approach to answering this question is leveraging the variation in the timing of the shutdown. So here we're only using the 51 courts that did shut down at some point, and we're putting in event study coefficients of the number of days before versus after shutdown. And here we can saturate the model with indicator variables for every single day in calendar time. And we're just looking at differences between early versus late shutdowns. And again, we're not really finding anything. So surprisingly to me, courts moving from physical to online operation didn't seem to have an impact on either consumer or business filings, as far as we can tell. Again, the next, we're still on analyzing the possibility that physical constraints are driving some of these bankruptcy outcomes. The second thing is looking at state shelter-in-place orders. And there's definitely some interaction between the court and state orders. So here again, we have some variation in the timing. We're looking at 2 different types of state orders: declaration of a state of emergency that tended to happen around mid-March, early to mid-March, and then stay-at-home orders, which happened toward the end of March, but with some with some variation. So these two policies do seem to be correlated with each other. So the lighter areas are the earlier state of emergency or stay-at-home orders, and then the darker areas are the later ones. And there's definitely some correlation also with the severity of COVID-19 infection. So if we think that is driving it, so people, don't want to go to a place where, regardless of what their governor is doing, people don't want to go to a place there are other people that might be generating infection. So we see Washington, New York, and California, some of the earlier states that had infections, were some of the earlier ones that implemented these statewide orders. So here we use the same specification as I just talked about, looking at states that implemented these and looking at variation in the timing. And again, we're definitely not seeing, unlike the earlier results where, right at mid-March, kind of almost the exact time of the nationwide state of emergency declaration, we saw bankruptcies drop. We're not seeing anything happen at the time of the declaration of emergencies. Definitely for the stay-at-home orders are just not very much going on. For consumer bankruptcies at the declaration of emergency, this is a little bit of an interesting result that I was like puzzling over. I was like, how can bankruptcies be increasing? We know bankruptcies are decreasing over time during this entire period for, kind of nationwide, but this suggests that at the time a state declares a state of emergency, the consumer bankruptcy rates are increasing. So again, if we look back at the map of states for the state declaration of a state of emergency, these were some of the states that maybe COVID infections tended to be greater. And because people in those states may have also been kind of stopped going to businesses and things like that, generating more financial distress, they were seeing a relative trend of increasing bankruptcies relative to other states. And so that is kind of a potentially interesting political economy type of point, but we're not seeing the declaration of a state of emergency leading directly to changes in the bankruptcy filing rate. So overall, to summarize this section, we're just not seeing much evidence that the physical constraints imposed by courts or states or COVID more generally are having direct impacts on the bankruptcy rate. So we can kind of the four main channels, so I'm actually going to wrap up in a second here. So to go back to the mechanism. So I kind of showed you what are the empirical results, how have bankruptcies been evolving over the COVID-19 crisis. And the next step is to look at why they're doing that. So the main results I've showed you so far have been on the physical constraints side. And I find the evidence pretty convincing, at least. We can do a little bit more on that side. And I'd love, again, feedback from the group on ways that we can do that. But I'm kind of downgrading the physical constraints channel, that we're not seeing a lot of evidence that physical constraints are leading to the drop in bankruptcies. I also talked a little bit about the liquidity constraint channel. So some of the time series evidence and things like the fact that Chapter 7 filings, we know ex ante liquidity constraints are much more binding from previous work, and just the nature of the fact that you have to pay fees up front as opposed to amortize that over time, the time series patterns and patterns across chapters suggest that liquidity constraints could be really significant and maybe even account for a large share of the overall drop in Chapter 7 filings. So I think there's some evidence to support the fourth channel, but we don't have direct empirical evidence yet to throw at the first two. So for uncertainty, it's very difficult to measure economic uncertainty. There's only 2 data points that I can point to in our results that points, something to that effect. So I'm actually going to go back, and I apologize for scrolling back through all of these slides, but the best evidence we have, again, is in the time series. So in my mind, economic uncertainty has changed dramatically over this time. So back in March and April, we really didn't know how long things would last. Many people believed that this would be temporary. So it could make sense to hold off on bankruptcy if you think it could just be a 2-week thing or 1-month thing. You don't want to just liquidate your business right away or file for bankruptcy that you can't file again for 8 years. But there should have been some shocks to uncertainty during this time as well. For example, the passage of the CARES Act on March 27th, we actually find no effect of that. So the announcement effect of an unprecedented $2 trillion federal stimulus package did not do anything to change the decline in bankruptcy. So we find no announcement effect of the CARES Act. So that's only one data point. But we are also seeing remarkably stable bankruptcy patterns throughout this entire time period, even though, in my mind, and we're going to try to throw direct measures of economic uncertainty at this empirically, but in my mind, there has been a lot of news that should change people's beliefs, but bankruptcy rates have remained very, very steady. So that's my best argument based on the evidence that we have on the economic uncertainty evidence. Certainly we can do better, and hopefully we will in the next version of our paper. And then substitutes expanding. We don't have direct evidence on this. Some of you have already mentioned really great ideas for the key kind of just reductions in demand for bankruptcy, i.e. reduction in financial distress overall. And there are ways of measuring that. So we're working on that right now. But I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. I will spend a couple minutes to conclude, but I'll pause here for some additional questions before I conclude.
So Jialan, can you speak a little bit about how the personal bankruptcy cases go through the court? How much time does it take for the personal bankruptcy case to be resolved in the court? And do we see that these times, for example, changed in any way during the pandemic? And do we see evidence of kind of any backlog of this building in the system?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So certainly another dimension on which we hope to expand our results is measuring bankruptcy outcomes. So right now, our only outcome is just measuring the filing event itself. So we can measure the date of filing. But in the data, we should be able to measure eventually, once these cases start to be resolved, the whether outcomes such as whether the case is dismissed, whether it's discharged, whether that person actually gets debt relief, or how long it takes to go through the bankruptcy system. And so certainly in previous work, one inefficiency is that when too many businesses or people file at the same time, a given judge only has limited capacity, and that leads to longer time periods and lower reorganization, kind of higher liquidation rates. So if you imagine a business having to be in bankruptcy for years because the system is congested, then we have loss of economic value, and that's a source of inefficiency. So a typical consumer case, and this is based on pure memory, so don't quote me on this, is probably going to be resolved within a month or so. So Chapter 7 filing, which is the less complicated form of filing, will probably be resolved within 30 days or so. We don't have any evidence right now on how that's changed over COVID, so that would actually be a really interesting thing to study. I'll also put a kind of promotion out for another research paper by me and our co-author Jeyul who are looking at the adoption of PACER itself. So the adoption of this electronic filing system that is allowing people today to access bankruptcy while totally online. That was adopted back in the 90s and 2000s, and so we're looking at the adoption of that and how that did it speed up bankruptcies and things like that. So that's a new paper that will hopefully be out soon. But it's kind of, we don't have direct evidence on the length of bankruptcies, and it usually would be resolved within a pretty short period of time. But Chapter 13 tends to be longer, because in order to achieve a discharge, you actually have to pay off your debt in 3 to 5 years. And the majority of consumers filing for Chapter 13 actually fail, that their case gets thrown out eventually because of various reasons. But one particular reason is that you're entering this 3 to 5 year repayment plan, and most of those repayment plans default. So essentially, a story with Chapter 13 is that you're about to be foreclosed on and lose your house. You file for Chapter 13 as a last-ditch effort to save your home. And in order to do that, you have to have this plan to pay off, pay off that debt over several years. And given that these people are in financial distress to begin with, many of those people fail to pay off those plans. You're supposed to pay off a large fraction of your disposable income, and they're just not able to do that. So eventually they end up losing their house anyway. So Chapter 13 plans take a much longer period to resolve.
Okay, there are a couple of questions related, suggesting some, help with econometric identification. So how about using the data of the first COVID-19 case in the state to leverage on a more exogenous variation? Well, not sure how much variation there is, though.
Yeah, so there was quite a bit of variation. So as I recall, Washington was the earliest state, although it didn't end up having super intense COVID. So I actually started this project by looking at Washington and Oregon and comparing, Washington, which had COVID-19 cases, which are some of the earlier ones that were publicized, versus Oregon, and found, just some kind of descriptive results there. And so we have collected some of that data. We haven't really leveraged it onto the bankruptcy outcomes. So I think, if I recall correctly, some of the other studies looking at outcomes such as consumer spending are not finding a huge we're finding that consumer spending declined nationwide, that actually the states that had more COVID-19 cases didn't necessarily experience larger declines in spending. So, and it's also the case that the states that shut down, explicitly by their governors, also didn't experience significantly different spending changes. So I would expect their bankruptcy results to be similar, that it's actually not driven by actual COVID-19 cases. But we have collected some of that data, but we haven't, I don't know that that's at the top of our list right now in terms of looking at cross-sectional measures.
Okay, could Google Trends data be useful? Maybe states with more searches for forbearance and loan forgiveness are more generous to borrowers.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is also on the same slide. So if I jump forward to, this is Google Trends. So we are thinking about how do we use this? So actually, some feedback on this would be great in terms of how do we work Google Trends into this analysis? I haven't worked that much with Google Trends before, but I do think it's an interesting, so I think of Google Trends as a measure of demand for bankruptcy. So in terms of our results, we find a drop in bankruptcies that could be driven by the fact that people don't need to file, that they just got all this money from the government and they're not going to restaurants. So financial distress itself has declined. Another story is that the supply of bankruptcy is restricted. So people actually want to file, but they don't have money, or they would like to file, but they don't have internet, and their court is online. So you have these two completely different interpretations, which are all totally different for policy implications. And Google Trends can help identify the demand side. So do we see people searching a lot for bankruptcy, but then not being able to file? So I haven't been able to discern very good patterns. So we are looking at trying to do it by state, but when you cut things down too much, like if you search for business bankruptcy, that is just too fun, or small business bankruptcy, and some states end up being too small of cells, so we can't even get that data. But I wasn't seeing significant trends. So we do see here in the Q1 2020 period that pretty big decline in searches for file for bankruptcy, and so but increases in some increases in bankruptcy lawyer. So there's some evidence that maybe this is consistent with an economic uncertainty channel, that people are not very interested in filing for bankruptcy during the Q1 period where we saw bankruptcy rates decline the most. But I'm still having a little, I haven't completely figured out how to integrate Google Trends into this analysis. So anyone who's used to using this data or has ideas, we would love to hear that.
Okay, the events that are related to bankruptcy are often clustered over time. So is there any way to consider the lags of the events and actions? For example, CARES Act could have lags between announcement and check deliveries.
So the lags between announcement and
of CARES Act and deliveries of check.
Right. So what I mentioned in the time series, and this is pretty consistent with other consumer finance studies, is that announcement effects are pretty rare, that the government, in past recessions has given out stimulus checks, and that's always announced in advance publicly. And again, one of our past papers is on government giving out stimulus checks in 2001 and 2008, and we didn't find any announcement effects in those papers, but the fact that when people got the money, they actually filed for bankruptcy more. And we interpret that to be consistent with liquidity constraints, that financial distress people need to save up some significant amount of money to access the bankruptcy system, and the government stimulus actually allowed them to do that. So again, here we are consistent with almost all other consumer finance studies. So again, I think one takeaway, one way to think about our results is that bankruptcy is behaving a little bit like a consumption good. If you look at consumer bankruptcies, the time series doesn't look that different from consumer spending. And it is a consumption good because you have to pay lots of money to file for bankruptcy. That the passage effect of CARES Act, there wasn't any, so there's no announcement effect, but the stimulus checks may have had a positive impact on bankruptcy filing rates. Again, consistent with our prior evidence on liquidity constraints, but inconsistent with the fact that you get more liquidity, but that you actually file for bankruptcy.
Okay, thank you.
If that's all the questions we have right now, I will go ahead and conclude. So, this is a complicated story and this paper is ongoing, so we don't have a very neat, one sentence conclusion here, but my personal takeaway from examining the evidence in detail, and also reading a lot of the other research on COVID-19 is that what I'm seeing is that the COVID-19 recession is fragmenting the economy, and that different groups such as high income people, we've seen that their employment is back up to pre-COVID levels. And in fact, higher income people are saving a lot of money, and that it's actually the low income people in high income zip codes that are hurt the most. The people who used to essentially work at restaurants in New York City, they're experiencing the worst effects of the current COVID-19 recession. So my interpretation is that the economy has been broken up, has been fragmented in different pieces. And when it comes to the bankruptcy system, I would group those pieces in, businesses and people into three broad groups. One is large corporations that are filing for bankruptcy more. This is what we would expect in a normal recession, and using the system as it's intended to help them reorganize their debts and potentially stay in business and keep those employment ties and keep that kind of organizational value. Next is homeowners. So those people are likely to have been receiving those enhanced unemployment checks and actually be making more income than they were prior to the recession. And they were also subject to, we didn't talk too much about the moratoria that the CARES Act essentially put a hold on student loans, and that you don't have to pay off your student loans anymore. So there was a relief period, and put a hold on evictions and foreclosures on government on properties with mortgages backed by government-sponsored entities. So homeowners benefited potentially a lot from these various stimulus policies. And we see Chapter 13 rates have a sustained drop of over 50% over the entire COVID-19 period, continuing to today. On the other hand, the final group of non-homeowners, so it's relatively lower income consumers and small businesses, we're seeing Chapter 7 rates very positively with the amount of government stimulus. So that suggests that there may be a lot of consumers and businesses that need to or want to file for bankruptcy, but are not able to because of liquidity constraints. And again, this is consistent with prior evidence. So I definitely think that all four of the factors that we pointed to are in play, and the trick is how do we separate them out and find, and maybe even try to quantify the relative roles of the different channels. I certainly think that the large federal stimulus policies are one major factor for why bankruptcies have declined, but I think there's more to the story here, judging by our cross-sectional and time series evidence. So again, the next stage of the paper is trying to identify the exact mechanisms by throwing more additional cross-sectional measures to empirically measure some of these four channels. But otherwise, I'll just wrap up, and thank you so much to this group for a really lively discussion. And I certainly welcome anyone to email us directly with any additional comments or suggestions that you have. Thank you so much.
So Jialan, thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for all the comments and questions that you had. I think it was a very lively discussion indeed. So with that, I would like to conclude today's seminar. Please don't forget to join us next week. We're going to have Ran Duchin from Boston College presenting next week. But for today, thank you very much again and have a wonderful day.